Good morning, sixth graders at Trotwood. It's nice to see you today. Well, let's see if we'll see anyone today. I am so excited, you guys, because you're probably hearing that hamster wheel spinning. I'll try not to get too distracted. I am so excited because we are this close to finishing our book. That's right. Our last day is tomorrow. We could probably finish today if we went for an extra long session, but I also want to give people the chance to catch up. If they're interested in catching up on a chapter or two that they missed before we go live with the final chapter tomorrow. You probably saw my notice in Google Classroom. That's how excited I was about it. So today we're actually going to have a double chapter of some short chapters. Chapter 23, Puzzles, and Chapter 24, Object Memory. So I remember a couple chapters ago when we finally caught up with Jack. He was given this puzzle by the Snow Queen where he had to take these shards of ice and arrange them into words. And if he could spell out the word that was his true heart's desire, the secret word, then she would give him what he wanted most in the entire world, whatever that is. So today, Hazel has said, she's spoken to the Snow Queen already, and the Snow Queen says Jack came with her willingly, so she'll let him go if he leaves willingly. The only question is whether or not Jack will want to go with Hazel, but she's going to try no matter what. Let's dive in. With Chapter 23, Puzzles. Jack could not make the pieces fit. He worked diligently, constantly, but every time he made something fit together, another problem presented itself. The pieces made him promises, but the promises were lies. The shards had secrets. He was never going to finish. He was afraid she would stop coming, that he would disappoint her, or even worse, bore her. She would lose interest, not even notice him anymore. He wouldn't give up, though. She would like that. And she had not come since giving him the puzzle. So when he sensed someone coming from the palace toward him, his head snapped up. He saw a small, dark shape struggling its way through the snow toward the lake. It was not the witch. He felt like he'd been plunged into the dark water. She wasn't coming. His hands moved back to the puzzle, but after a few moments his eyes flickered back to the shape. It was a girl, and she was made of colors. She was standing at the edge of the lake now. She seemed very small. Something about the girl tugged at him, and he wished the witch were there to kiss him on the forehead and make it go away. He looked down, and one of the pieces called to him. Its edges clarified before his eyes, and he understood it, or thought he did. He took one of the small sections he'd been able to make and tried to add the piece to it, but it wouldn't fit. His eyes flickered upward again. The girl was still there. She was edging her way onto the lake now. She picked up one foot and set it carefully onto the ice, and then the other. She slipped a little, and her arms shot out to the sides. Jack had never seen anyone approach him on the lake before. The witch always just appeared. The ice seemed a treacherous thing to walk on, and the girl was having trouble. She moved as lightly as a baby bird, but she still bobbled and slid. The ice floated on the dark water in broken pieces, large versions of the puzzle Jack had at his feet. The girl took big, careful steps over the cracks in the ice, moving in wobbly, slow motion. And then she came upon a crack too big to step over. She stared at the dark water and at the patch of ice just out of reach. She hugged herself again, and her eyes traveled ahead and met his. She looked at him so sadly. He wished he could help, but he couldn't make the pieces fit together. The girl's face tightened, and she took a couple of uneasy steps away from the edge of the ice floe, squeezed her arms to the sides, and leapt over the dark crevice. She landed at the edges of the next floe and slipped. Her feet flew up from under her, and she contorted herself in the air so she wouldn't fall backward. The side of her face thwacked on the ice, water splashed up at her hair and feet. She pushed herself up, grimacing and holding her head. Jack looked down at his puzzle. Even the pieces he'd fit together seemed wrong now. Everything he did seemed to make it worse. He moved one of the pieces around, thinking its secrets might reveal themselves that way. He was surprised to look up and see the girl standing in front of him, looking down at him like he held her life in his hands instead of shards of ice. She was big-eyed and shivering, with wet shoes and hair. Her face was dark where she had hit the ice. Her chest heaved up and down. She had an enormous scar on her cheek. He put the piece he was holding down and looked up at her. Her eyes were darker than the lake, and they welled as they looked at him, as if he was the one who had almost fallen through the ice. He wasn't worth her tears. He missed the witch. He was nothing. Chapter 24. Object Memory. Hazel stared at the frozen remnant of her friend. His skin was tinged with blue, his eyelashes and hair were covered in frost. He was hard and dull, and there was no life to him at all. She could feel that her head was shaking and her eyes had tears in them. She had to work to take in a breath because her body wouldn't breathe in a world where Jack could look like this. She leaned down and put her hand on his shoulder. "Jack," she whispered. He flinched. "You're warm," he said. She drew back. "Jack," she said again, because that was his name, and that, at least, was something that she could give him. "It's Hazel. Jack, we have to go home." Surely there was something better to say than this, but she couldn't think of anything else in the whole world. He tilted his head at her, like her words made no sense to him, like he was already home. "No," she said, shaking her head quickly. "No, listen." Hazel closed her eyes. All this way, and she had nothing. "Jack, you're Jack. Please, here, look." She took down her backpack and got out the broken shard of mirror that the match girl had given her. "You're Jack," she said, putting the mirror in front of him. "Jack Campbell. Do you see? And you're made of baseball and superheroes and castles and lots of Hazel's past, and even if you lost them to the wind, it doesn't matter." Jack looked into the shard of mirror, and his eyes widened in surprise. As he stared, his face darkened. Hazel glanced down and then startled. The image in the mirror was Jack, but 10 times worse. Dark blue and seemingly made out of cracked ice. She let out a gasp. Jack looked up at her, eyes wide. "He's terrible." "No, no," she said, drawing the mirror back. "He's not. You're not. Jack." Jack blinked at her. His eyes fell warily to the mirror shard again, as if it might confirm a terrible truth, and Hazel tossed it aside. I'm sorry," she said, struggling valiantly to keep her voice steady. "Forget that. That's nothing." She needed to warm him up, that was it. She reached into the backpack again and pulled out the matches and the tinder box. She tried to strike the match, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't. A tear spilled out of her eye, and she rubbed it away quickly. She tried again, and with a psst, the match was lit. She held it close to him and whispered, "Do you feel that? It's warm." The last part sounded like a plea. He looked at her, confused. Hazel's heart buried itself in her chest. What was she thinking? Like one match had any power against all this cold. His eyes went to the flame, and then something passed over his face, and he peered at the flame like it had a secret to tell him. "What is it?" Hazel asked, trying to control her voice. "Do you see something?" He shook his head, but kept staring. Hazel looked into the light, searching desperately for magic, because she needed it now. It was nothing but flame. Hazel closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them again. "I see something," she said, her words a whisper. He looked up at her. "I do," she said, trying to sound more sure. "I see you at your house. Do you remember your house? You live next door to me. Your kitchen is bigger than mine and yellower, and it's got these big blotchy flowers that you think look like soup stains, and you've got a plastic table in it." Hazel took a breath. He was still staring into the flame. "You're in the kitchen, and I'm with you. We're sitting there in your sparkly plastic chairs making little clay guys. First you did a knight, and I did a robot. I thought the robot would win, but you said that was the obvious choice. People always pick the robots, and the knight's ability to think freely would eventually win out. Now you're making a dragon, and I'm making a velociraptor. You're having trouble with the neck. It's too wobbly. You tell me a T-Rex would be better. And I say you always think a T-Rex would be better, and then you remind me what your knight did to my robot." The flame was dying now, but Jack still stared. "I say," she said, her voice firm and clear, "that if you're fighting a fire-breathing dragon, and when you meet a dragon it's best to assume it's fire-breathing, then what you want is speed, and the element of surprise. The dragon's going to fight hard against the T-Rex, but the velociraptor won't seem like much of a threat. It's small. The dragon doesn't know it's got a sickle claw. He just sees the feathers and thinks it's a goofy dino bird." And the flame was gone. All there was smoke, dissolving into the lightning sky. Hazel had lost her words. Her eyes went to Jack. Something had changed. He was shuddering violently now, and he dropped the shard he was holding. "I'm cold," he said. "Oh," she choked. Okay, Jack." She felt like someone was scooping out her chest. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I gave everything away. I don't have anything else. His teeth were chattering loudly. Hazel thought she might freeze just looking at him. "Okay, listen," she said. The backpack." Hazel took the last thing out, the baseball, set it on the ice, and then struck another match and put it to the backpack. The flame took hold of the backpack for a moment, then smoked and smoldered and died out. Hazel whimpered. "You lit your backpack on fire," Jack said. Hazel let out a small gasp and shook her head. She was going to fail, all this way only to learn that there was nothing she could do. Jack looked at her, shuddering and clattering and wide-eyed. His eyes fell on the baseball next to her. "What is that?" he asked. She picked up the baseball. It was firm and real in her hands. "This?" she asked. "Can I see that?" he asked through chattering teeth. "Of course," she said, handing it to him. He turned it over in his hands, considering it. His eyes fell on the big black scruff and then the signature. He studied it a moment. He moved his fingers around the soft leather, then ran his thumb slowly across the bumpy stitches. "You gave that to me," Hazel said in a whisper. "It's a baseball, signed by Joe Mauer. He's your favorite baseball player," she added. He looked up at her, his hand firm around the baseball. "You're going to be a catcher someday, like him," she said. "You're going to hit 900 home runs, which is better than Wolverine, I think. You got the ball yourself. You went to a game with your dad last summer. The Twins won in the 11th inning. It was late, but your dad said you could stay until the end because Campbells don't leave baseball games early. And Mauer hit a pop foul right to you. You didn't bobble it or anything. It fell into your hands like a gift. The people around you clapped. It was on the Jumbotron and everything. Some guy next to you said they could use you at shortstop, and it was so late. But you and your dad waited outside after the game, and finally all the players came out, and you waited some more, and you practiced what you were going to say. And then Joe Mauer came out, and you just held out the ball to him because you forgot how to speak English. And he smiled at you and asked you if he could sign your ball, and you just nodded like a big dork. And he did sign it, and he told you to get some sleep, and you didn't let anyone else touch the ball, and you looked up on the internet how to preserve it best, and you didn't even let me touch it. And then, Hazel shook her head. She was crying now, and the tears burned at the scar and bit her face. My dad left, and I didn't know what to do, and you came over, and... Hazel dissolved. The words flew away. There was nothing. Jack looked down at the ball and squeezed it. He turned it around in his hands again. And then he looked up and blinked. "Hazel?" You know the drill. Tomorrow at 11, I will see you for Hazel and the Woods. If you want to talk back about the book, we can do a Zoom tomorrow at 1, where I'm going to be there to answer schoolwork questions, but also talk about the book some more. If you have any questions for the author or anything you're thinking about, remember you can drop it in the comments below, or you can email them to me if you have my address. I love you lots. Thanks for sticking with me today for these 2 chapters, and I'll see you tomorrow for Hazel in the Woods. Bye.